and welcome to our new episode with Astrid, your APD, your dietitian with D, no C. And today I'm having a great guest, Andy Galpin. This episode is going to be really, really great. So when we are in a calorie deficit and there's a negative energy balance, where does the fat go when we lose fat? We're also going to cover whether you can out-exercise a poor diet or you can't out-diet not training. Other things like, why do we fart? So make sure you stay until the end of the video and make sure you like, you give us some hearts, smash that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you on the other side. It really comes down to what works for you and how better you can adhere to it.
What about if you give us a little bit of an extra background of what do you do? Why did you choose that career?
My full-time job is I am a professor at Cal State Fullerton. So I direct what's called our Center for Sport Performance. So we study anything that could potentially enhance human performance. So my specialty is muscle biology. So I took muscle samples and biopsies from folks, and we study muscle at that cellular and molecular level. I teach sports nutrition, program design at the graduate level, strength and conditioning principles, things like that. And then on top of that, I work with professional athletes. So I work with some Major League Baseball players and a lot of combat sport athletes. So a lot of boxers and wrestlers and a lot of MMA fighters, UFC fighters, and folks like that. So a little bit of science, a little bit of teaching, and then a little bit of working with actual athletes.
That's amazing. Why did you choose being a teacher?
Teaching, coaching, it's really the same thing. So I don't know, I enjoy it. I wanted a lifestyle that I don't actually have to work. So that's pretty fucking awesome.
Yes.
So that was a large part of it. But of course, I like learning myself. It's for whatever reason, I'm just totally addicted to it. So teaching enables me to act like I'm doing something for my job, but I'm just doing it for myself. A good example is this series of videos I just got done filming on hypertrophy. It just gave me an excuse to really dive into that literature more and read a bunch of papers that I've been wanting to read, but I didn't really have an excuse to do it.
Yes.
So I had other priorities, if you will, and so this is a chance to do it. So making sure I'm continually on top of the research, teaching my students makes me a better teacher, but it just lets me have an excuse to read and learn more. So
That's also absolutely true. I think I have the same approach when it comes to do certain things. I do a lot of that. It sort of keeps me accountable, and it also lets me dig into topics that I would probably do it on my own if I don't have that push that I have to actually work on that topic. So that's amazing. That way, I think this is going to lead us really well into quite a few questions that I prepare that we could also have a good discussion. There's a lot of people around that they actually ask these questions quite a lot, and I'm sure they can dive in a little bit deeper in all your YouTube videos. That you have awesome 5 minutes, 25 minutes, or 55-minute physio and nutrition education videos. But here we want to just briefly touch base on some topics that we probably will see they come up a lot, and they ask this often. So where does fat go when we burn it? Does it go to one place or the other?
Sure. Well, this is one of the major fascinations we have with physiology, right? But the quick answer is the majority of the fat you lose when we're talking about actual fat loss comes through respiration. And so the very simple answer is when you take a breath, you breathe in mostly oxygen. That's O2, right? That's mostly what's in our atmosphere. When you breathe out, you exhale CO2. So the difference is carbon. So your fat is basically big, long chains of carbon. So the fat on your belly, you cut off one carbon, if you will. You put it in your blood. You attach that to the oxygen. That's why you breathe in the first place, actually. The only reason you do that is so that you can run this process. That oxygen attaches to that carbon, and you exhale. So there was a carbon molecule that used to be on your belly, and now it's out in space. And so because atoms have physical size and weight, and you've lost an atom of carbon, you've lost a little, microscopic amount of size on your belly. Well, when you repeat that process billions of times, that little amount starts to become visible to the naked eye. And so that's how you actually get that fat off your belly and back into the atmosphere.
That's a good explanation. So if you wanted to go or give a little bit of a further example, how does that happen? We eat food, we digest it, it gets broken down, it's absorbed, distributed to all the systems. Some of that is utilized a certain way, some of that is stored. What happens when we obviously provoke a energy deficit? So that is what energy balance makes us, or allows it for the mechanisms of fat burning. So what happens in that situation?
It's what I call the third grade circle of life, right? It's probably something you learned in third grade or something like that. Remember, when you eat food, anything that is organic or alive means it's based in carbon. And so a carbohydrate is just a molecule of carbon that has a water attached to it. It has been hydrated. Most carbohydrates, like glucose, blood sugar, is 6 carbons and 6 waters. Fat is the same thing, okay? So whether you eat those things and you put them in your belly, and then they get broken down and then stored, fat from something else or fat on your stomach, it's really the same thing molecularly. So when you go to rid yourself of it, in fact, the only reason we eat is so that we can gain more carbon. So if you eat carbon in your stomach and then you breathe out carbon, well, what tells you whether you're going to have a net gain of carbon on your body or net loss of carbon on your body is, are you eating more carbon than you're exhaling? Basically, that's all it is. So if you want to lose some of the stored carbon you have, then you either need to stop ingesting so much, or you need to start putting out more exhalation via breathing more. And the easy way to do that, of course, is to exercise, so that you can get into a hyperventilating state where you don't actually feel nauseous and pass out. So that's really kind of the most simplistic view is, and this is why, honestly, if you look across, say, the science, high fat, low carb diets, high carb, low fat diets, none of these things really matter when it comes to effective fat loss. They're all pretty equal because they're just different systems of helping you eat less total calories. Yeah. And in this case, less carbon, right? That's really what it's about, is carbon. So either way is fine. The difference between those diets comes down to things just like personal preference, which one works better for you, and then other factors are what we call context that's specific to you. So that's really what we're talking about. And the way I call it the carbon circle of life is because plants do the exact opposite, right? So humans breathe in O2 and breathe out CO2. And so in theory, we elevate the amount of CO2 in the environment. Plants breathe in CO2 and breathe out O2. And so they capture the carbon because they're able to use the energy from the light and the sun to steal the carbon from the air. And so they enhance their size by enhancing their carbon stores because they can grab it from the air. We can't do that as humans. And so our way to bring in CO2 is to eat the plants, if you will, or other animals. And so that's all it is. It's just circling carbon from plants to our belly, from our belly to the air, from the air back into the plant, or the other animal. That's all it is really about.
So a follow-up question that someone could just hear that and say, or ask, well, if I need to breathe more and I just exhale pretty much what is the fat that I burn, should I be breathing more all the time? How does that work?
Yeah, in theory you could. If you just exhaled a whole bunch more carbon, problem is that changes your blood, the pH, the acidity level in your blood, and you have all kinds of other problems. And so it's not sustainable. But in theory, you could just sit there and be like, and technically you're losing small amounts of fat, but it's a very, very low number. It's far easier to just not eat that bagel or whatever. Yeah. It's a lot more carbon in the bagel than it is that you could get out in a few huffs of breath.
So that would explain perhaps how people with difficulties breathing or COPD would get a higher metabolic rate just because they're actually breathing much more.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, this is one of the companies that I work with, HHP, the Health and Human Performance Foundation. It's a nonprofit really dedicated to all things breath work. And we see this, I mean, dude, it's crazy. So much of all physiology, emotional management, stress, anxiety, it's all directly tied to CO2. In fact, we just finished one recent study on the relationship between what we call CO2 tolerance, so your ability to tolerate an elevation in blood CO2, and anxiety, state and trait anxiety. And so it's pretty clear, and we use this in almost every athlete I work with. We'll have some sort of work with, their CO2 tolerance, so we'll do specific breath work because it is so tied into everything. You start altering O2 and CO2 concentrations in your body, and things start happening. You can feel that physically within seconds, temperature changes, tingling changes, and you can see changes emotionally very quickly. So we use it as pre-workout stuff, post-workout stuff. We can see changes in adrenaline, other hormones, testosterone, all this stuff really quickly. We use it pre-bed, we use it mid-workout stuff, we use them as our own training sessions. So there's a lot going on with the chemistry there. Turns out physiology is kind of complicated and fun.
It is very fun. When I did my bachelor's degree and I did physiology, I was in love with the first session of the physiology. This is so amazing. And when you study parts of physiology, it is even so incredible how things that go wrong when physiology wouldn't work as it is. So that was amazing as well. So what is more important in your opinion in regards to food? When it comes to energy balance, what is most important, quality or quantity?
In my opinion, it's a false dilemma because the two are wrapped into each other so much. If you want to be an absolutist, it's really simply about what we call CICO, right? Calories in, calories out. But calories in, calories out is not the amount of calories on your food label. That is only a portion of it because you have to factor in quality. An example would be a higher quality food, say a piece of fruit. Let's compare 100 calories on a piece of fruit to 100 calories of a fruit snack, so a candy, right, if you will. Well, presumably the real fruit would have a higher fiber content. Well, the higher fiber content is not actually going to be digested, and so the amount of calories associated with the fiber won't actually be absorbed. So although you're eating the same amount of calories, quote unquote, it's not being handled, processed, digested, and absorbed the same thing. And so you can't just simply say, oh, I'm going to compare a 2,000 calorie a day diet of candy versus a 2,000 calorie diet of fresh fruits and vegetables and say, therefore, calories in, calories out doesn't matter. It 100% matters. You just don't understand what calories in and calories out actually means. So you have to take into account thermal effect of food. So how much energy your body has to burn breaking these things down. You have to take into effect even outside of that, what it does to satiety, how full you feel, your sensations and desires to continue eating, how that influences what's called your chronobiology and the time of day and your sleep patterns, and all of these things go into it. So at the end of the day, if you run the full equations, it still does come down to calories in, calories out, but much more goes into those equations than just, oh, I looked up how many calories I burn per day on an online calculator, and then I measured the food on my label, and I didn't lose weight. Therefore, something else is going on. It's just simply more complicated than that.
Yeah, calories in, calories out. Obviously, you want to look at not just how this balance out, where everything that you do in one side of the equation will eventually affect the other, and this is something that goes back and forth. So it's not like just one-sided.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, this statement of, well, not all calories are created equal. And I hear a lot of that statements in a lot of people. What is that, your stand on that statement, quote unquote?
Well, sure. I mean, anytime you say two different things are different, then you're right. Because if they weren't different, you wouldn't call them different. The question comes down, like, what do you mean semantically about that? Again, can you just say 2,000 calories of fruit juice is the same as 2,000 calories of fruit? Clearly not. They won't be handled the same way. And so one of the things we'll talk about with like the kind of going back to the quality versus quantity thing, most of the time, if you just handle the quality issue, the quantity will handle itself. And so you don't necessarily have to worry about one calorie being equal to another calorie because, again, the quality will help you regulate that on its own. So it kind of depends on how many hairs you want to split and how nitpicky you want to get. Look, the reality of it is we have to lie every single second in every single sentence we use with people. There's some amount of truth that we're saying, but there's some amount of we're just saying, I'm going to kind of skip over that because in order to actually explain that, we would never be able to have effective communication. Right?
That's true, yeah.
So we just have to kind of lie a little bit, and so it just depends on how nitpicky you want to get on that particular sentence.
But if you wanted to get really, really picky, you want to say, well, calorie is a calorie, regardless of what you comparing to, because it is a unit of measurement. It's not a human, it's not a particle that just lives around food.
Yeah, this is a very good point. We tend to personify, is the term, right? Personify molecules, we personify numbers into thinking like, oh, this thing is bad. Like oxidative stress is bad. Like it doesn't have a brain. It doesn't hate you. Like there's no good and bad. Like, mTOR is not good for you. Testosterone is not good for you. They're not humans. They don't have brains. They don't have souls. Carbon's not this way. Like, yeah, you're exactly right. It's a unit of measure. It's not a good or a bad thing. You can't change it. It's don't personify. Don't make it into human and give it human characteristics.
Correct. What at the end of the day, what matters is, well, it's not the actual calorie, it's the food composition that is going to make the difference, whether it affects your satiety or the thermic effect of food, or this equation will be affected obviously by the quality and the food composition we're eating, and that's going to make the difference. But at the end of the day, 1 calorie will be the same 1 calorie of a bagel will be the same as 1 calorie of a chicken breast.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. You could have the highest quality food in the world, and if you eat too many calories, you're going to gain weight. Like, period. It doesn't matter. So you can't say calories don't count either. They clearly both do.
Absolutely. Why vegetables would be always so important and recommended?
Well, they're delicious, number one. That's a lie. They're not. Like, they're just the least good food group, period. Let's be real here for a second. I probably went like a solid decade of my life, maybe more, without eating a vegetable, unless you count ketchup. And like hot sauce is a vegetable. That would really be about it. But we tend to recommend them for several reasons. Number one, they're very high in nutrient density. Right? So this could be any combination of micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, polyphenols, a whole bunch of things like that. So you're going to get a big influx of things that we generally consider to be good for humans. The nice part about that is they tend to be packed pretty well. So they tend to come in combinations that make them very effective, which is another thing. So we know that certain vitamins and minerals need others to be absorbed, digested, and utilized more appropriately. And it tends to come in foods in good combinations. It's kind of the least scientific way I can say that. Another thing is they tend to be high in fiber, which is in and of itself highly associated with many health and performance benefits. Because of that, then they have the ability to improve gut quality and gut health in a lot of different ways, which is, again, always important whether we're talking health or performance. And then finally, they are incredibly calorically sparse. In fact, depending on the vegetable you're talking about, for the most part, I don't even have athletes count them as part of their like calorie intake. Eat as much lettuce as you want. I don't care at all about broccoli intake until we get to very specific scenarios and situations. Asparagus, whatever, zucchini, don't even put it down on your list. Don't even care, right? Now you start getting to root vegetables, we have to start taking those into consideration because the caloric density is a lot higher. But carrots, I don't care. Beets, whatever, like just fire away on these things. So those are some of the main reasons why we recommend vegetable intake.
Would that be the same for fruit, or they are more calorically dense, but would you say the same in the sense of the nutrient composition?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, we strongly encourage fruit intake. And remember, I work with athletes who have to lose massive amounts of weight in very short periods of time. And we still have them on fairly high fruit diets, if you will. So, yeah, you got to remember, fruit is, same with vegetables, actually. Depending on the one you choose, they're usually 95% or higher in water content. So you're eating mostly water. Yes, fruit is higher in calorie equivalents than vegetables typically, but it's still overall a very low calorie food. An apple is 125 calories or something. Like, these are not big numbers compared to an average size bowl of pasta or something. You're like, oh crap, that was 80 grams of carbohydrate right there. You wouldn't accidentally eat 80 grams of carbohydrate. It'd be like 4 bananas. So, you know what I mean? Like, the calories are still they're a lot higher when you compare them to, cauliflower, but they're not very high compared to avocados. They're not very high compared to olive oil. They're not high at all compared to cheese and things that are just really, really delicious that have much higher density. So we rarely worry about them, and with the exception of, at the very, very end of the weight cut. So they're not something that, I'm scared of usually ever.
No, and this is a funny part, because they are very nutritious, but they are not like processed food that they're very highly palatable, that they just trigger you to eat more just because it is no satiating at all, or pretty much because they have that sweet spot of the combination of the exact amount of fat, salt, and sugar that makes it not addictive, but have addictive-like properties that want you to eat more. But that wouldn't happen with fruit, for example.
Yeah, well, it's also, if you look at it, again, I don't deal with obesity clinically. I don't deal with anything clinically usually, ever. So when we ask about fruit, my assumption is you're trying to improve performance. And some of the folks I work with, weight's not an issue. Baseball players, there's no weigh-ins. But most of the athletes I do, weight is a consideration. So I feel like I can speak pretty confidently about those that are interested in not gaining fat mass. And so that to say, this is just not something we're ever really concerned about, because it plays very little issue. In fact, we generally see, and in fact, the literature would show this too, that there's usually an association with reduction in body fat with an increased consumption of fruit. So it's generally a pretty good thing, and it's not something that we should really ever fear.
And especially with people that come and say, well, but fructose makes you fat.
Yeah, well, people say dumb things all the time, so add that to the list.
All right, so maybe a follow-up question. Why do we fart?
I have, I think, an hour-long video plus on that, so you can go see the details there. Really, that was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke to put as I wanted to put together a talk on digestion and generally how we break down and process carbohydrates. And I was just like, man, if I title this video "Digestion and Assimilation of Carbohydrates," like kids are just gonna die. And I was just like, well, how else can I do this up? And I'm like, well, people don't realize that the vast majority of gastrointestinal distress that you deal with is because of carbohydrate. There's lots of it. People think, oh, like they get the protein farts and stuff, and those are rarely the case. And so I just thought it'd be funny, and I would title the video and kind of center around why people fart so much. So in general, it's not because of protein or fat. It's usually because of carbohydrate, and specifically there are some subcategories. But the quick answer is the type of carbohydrate that isn't quickly broken down in your small intestine, and it has to go to your large intestines where we don't have proper enzymes. And that's fiber. I think we call a special kind of carbohydrate we call FODMAP, and then a few other ones, resistant starches and stuff. So they have to go to our large intestine, which has a subset of its own bacteria, and the bacteria there have the enzymes capable of breaking down these food items. But as a result of that, those bacteria give off gas. And so that gas becomes our gas. So technically, no one's ever really gassy. It's just your large intestine bacteria that are gassy. But if you feed them a lot, that gas has to come out somewhere.
When you think about people with IBS or maybe just more digestive problems, that's why they probably will have obviously more undigested food that will go into the large intestine to be processed by these gut bacteria. So you will have more gas and more bloating. And that's why that probably you can explain that as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what happens there. So we have to make sure that that you're getting the types of carbohydrates that you have the ability to break down. So a very, very, very common example is beans, right? And so everyone knows the kind of nursery rhymes that go along with beans. You know what I'm getting at there, right? So, yeah. But the rationale is, especially if you don't eat a lot of beans, then you down-regulate the digestive enzymes required to break those things down. And then you have this giant bolus of beans, and of course, that's what happens. And so a quick way to fix that is to just consume small amounts of beans a little bit more frequently. You'll keep and enhance the amount of those digestive enzymes in the small intestines, and those problems won't be so rampant. So yeah, you can easily help folks that have things like a little bit of bloating and stuff. You also need to regulate and understand the type of fiber you're eating. So you can look up the difference between soluble and insoluble fiber. And so we see this somewhat commonly as people want to get really, really, really healthy, and they go from a diet that's extremely low in fiber, and it's McDonald's, it's all these other things, and then they go and they just eat nothing but broccoli all day, and their stomach just blows to pieces, and they're like, I'm going back to pizza. Like, I felt way better. And that's because you really didn't pay attention to the difference between soluble and insoluble fiber. And so maybe you need to exchange out some of that broccoli for a little more pizza, and your stomach will feel quite a bit better. So yeah.
If you're not used to eat a lot of fiber, that is also going to affect you. Like if you go from zero or very little amount of fiber to the other one extreme, just because you think you decided that day is a day that you want to be healthy, and then you start eating a lot of vegetables, then you're obviously going to feel bloated and uncomfortable, because this is a very extreme change from very little amount of fiber to a lot of fiber, and you won't be able to process it very well. And especially you won't be used to that sensations in your gut. So that's going to make it more uncomfortable.
Exactly.
What is your stance on you can't out-exercise a poor diet, but you can't out-diet no training? What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so you can't out-exercise a bad diet?
A poor diet, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll start there first. And this kind of goes back to what I said earlier in that it's just far easier to not eat the food than it is to try to out-exercise it. And what I mean by that is people's caloric expenditure with exercise is far lower than you think. So people think like, oh, I went to this like cardio kickboxing class at the gym or spin class or something, and I burned 1,000 calories in the hour. You probably burned like 200. I mean, maybe 300, 400, 500. You can get that high, but for the most part, people are burning, a few hundred calories in their workouts. And so you can either work your ass off for 45 minutes in the gym, or you could have just had one less slice of toast. And so it's really far, far easier to just not have quite as much food. And so that's why it doesn't matter how hard you train, really. If you're not eating properly, you're going to lose that exchange almost every single time. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part of your question was, you can't out-diet no training at all. Yeah, so I guess is this referring to the fact that by just dieting alone rather than not training at all and trying to reach optimal outcomes? Is that the fallacy you're getting
Yeah.
at? Yeah. So it's got to be part of the equation. We would typically say this. I know, and you could certainly point to tens of thousands of people who have lost a lot of fat without exercising at all. It's very possible. And if you ask me which one is more important for fat loss, exercise or diet, it wouldn't even be close. Diet 100 times over. However, if you want to look at the research on sustained weight loss, so those people who can lose the weight and keep it off, you see that associated exercise is highly correlated with sustained weight loss. And people who lose fat without exercising have a significantly lower chance of keeping that weight off. And so it's, yeah, I would say if you want to just lose weight, fine, stop eating. But if you want to really, and I mean like a lot, really significantly enhance your chances of keeping that fat off, as well as keeping the weight loss to mostly fat rather than fat and some muscle, then resistance exercise especially, and any form of exercise, becomes critically important for those equations. And if we look at people, for the most part, whether they realize it or not, that's what they want. They want sustained fat loss and either maintain the muscle they have or even add some muscle. So when you factor that in the equation, I just really can't see the rationale for excluding or minimizing the role of resistance exercise in that process, or any exercise at all.
And you want to look at the context as well of the question, because if you think about no diet, like if you don't eat or you eat perhaps a lot of protein, thinking that you're going to gain muscle, but you don't train, that's not going to really happen.
Yeah, I mean, you would put on, in that specific example, you would put on a little bit of muscle mass because protein itself is such a strong anabolic signal, but not nearly as much as you think. It wouldn't be much, and it wouldn't be great.
Correct. So what are common nutrition mistakes that you see when people are trying to lose weight, change something from their diet, or improve performance?
Yeah, several common ones jump out. Number one probably is they don't appropriately adjust calories. And so, example would be if you're normally eating 4,000 calories a day and you want to lose weight and all of a sudden you want to cut that to 2,000. Both my experience, physiology, as well as the research and the literature would show is that's a very bad idea. It's not sustainable. In fact, it's almost a guaranteed recipe for failure. It's like a 98% likelihood of you're going to fail if you cut calories that drastically. If you're like 600 pounds, you might get away with it or something. But for the most part, it's almost a guarantee of failure doing that. So what do you want to do instead? Probably more like a 10 to 15% reduction in calorie. 20 maybe at the absolute most if you're, talking like really morbidly obese. Okay, and there's plenty of people like that. So if you want to moderate, you want sustainable, you want something that is a lifestyle change, not a diet, right? So this is your whole brand, right, Holmes? Like, you don't want to be on a diet all the time. Diet is a recipe for not there. You want a lifestyle change, right? So we want to make this a different part of your culture. So those are very common mistakes that people make. I think other mistakes is people tend to get, they implement a system that does not match their personality. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean some of us do really well if I said, okay, I want you to weigh and measure every single thing and be precise and stick to exactly 1,650 calories. And I want your carbohydrates to be at 35%, fat to be at 25, etc. Right? Some people actually, that makes the system a lot better. My friend Mark Bell is like that. He cannot do moderation, period. He has to be 100%, this is the rule. He needs a small amount of rules, but they need to be very specific and extreme. And he knows they're extreme. He knows it's not necessary for all people. And so he'll do things like he wants to lose weight. He'll go no carb for a while. Or he'll go super low fat. Or he'll do these things that he knows aren't necessary. But he can't have a little bit of carbohydrate. He can't have a few bites of ice cream. Like, it just doesn't work for him. And he has that self-awareness. So he's able to lose all kinds of weight and stay really, really lean a lot because he understands what system will work and which ones don't. And he's very brutally honest about that with himself. You could be the opposite. You could be saying like, whoa, like I'm making this way too much of a part of my life. It's ruining everything. I just need to work by concept. I need to just kind of manage, check my weight every day. And when I start coming up a pound or so, then I need to just make sure I back off food a little bit for the next week. But I'm not going to get too neurotic about it. And that would be a system for you. So it doesn't matter. Clearly, either approach is fine, or any combination in between. Just make sure that it fits your lifestyle and it is something that you're like, okay, it's always going to be a little bit of pain in the ass. I mean, like, let's be real. I wish I could just sit around and eat cookies and shit all day. Like, I always want that. You're never going to be in a diet where like, oh my God, I don't even crave anything besides vegetables all day. Like, bullshit. So there's always some struggle. There's always some oh man, like I really want another cookie, but I'm not going to. You just want it to be manageable.
Absolutely. So when it comes to a word that I really hear a lot, well, actually don't hear a lot, but I think it has a meaning that we tend to use a lot. What does hormesis mean? How would you be able to use this concept to be understood within nutrition and exercise?
Yeah, so everything has a toxicity curve, is the way another way to think about hormesis is kind of a cliche saying that which does not kill me makes me stronger. So these would both fall under the umbrella of hormesis, really. So it says this, okay, we often think about if something is good, more is better. And what hormesis says is, all right, something at a low amount might be good, but at a high amount it actually may be toxic, or the inverse, right? Another way to think about it is, hey, if I give you a little bit of something that's bad, that's actually probably good because then you'll come back bigger and stronger. So let me give you some tangible examples. Water. I just got done doing a whole series of things on water. All right, if I took all the water out of your body and you had no water whatsoever, and then I gave you a little bit of water, you would see a pretty strong increase in your physical health. And if I gave you a little bit more water, you would see a greater increase. And if I gave you even more water, you see an even greater increase. So there'd be almost this linear relationship between how much water I give you and how much of an improvement in your physical health you would see. And so people didn't stop right there and they think, okay, therefore, maximize water intake. More water is better. Well, because we know everything has a toxicity curve. Eventually, you'll get to a position where you're optimally hydrated. And that's fantastic. You go a little bit further and things maybe start to get a little bit worse. You continue to go even further and further and further and further, and now you're drowning, literally, right? You could enter what's called hyponatremia. And people actually die. Someone dies every single year by drinking too much water in a marathon. Every year somebody dies because of it. We see consistently people lose their peak performance in endurance events because they overhydrated. And so everything has a toxicity curve. Oxygen, fiber, water, all of it. So you don't want to just maximize all these things. Iron, supplements, minerals. I mean, you name it. We want to understand where the optimal amount actually is. So if you dose yourself, then the other part of hormesis is the stress response part, right? So if you say something like, okay, let's take inflammation, and inflammation is bad, right? We don't want inflammation. Well, you cause yourself inflammation every day when you work out. You get inflamed. That's actually the signal that causes growth. So you have to create a little bit of damage there. Then when you back off, you get this response to come back bigger, stronger, better. In fact, that's how adaptation occurs. And so we have to have a little bit of treatment of toxicity to ourselves so that we can come back and build up resistance to that. And when we use it, when we do exercise, and we call that's what we want, positive adaptation, right? So that's really hormesis in a nutshell of understanding both where we're at on the curve, as well as not thinking that something is bad. Like we talked about, inflammation isn't a person. It's right? It doesn't hate you. It's not inflammation is bad and growth is good. Like they're cells, they're molecules, they're atoms. They don't give a shit about any of that thing. They don't do those things. They just connect to other things that are charged appropriately. That's all they do. It just has a physiological response. And we tend to think about the things like growth as being positive and breakdown as being negative, but that's just not the case. So
I guess people don't understand the difference between inflammation being acute inflammation and low-grade chronic inflammation, which is the one we don't want to have it in our system.
Yeah, well, this is a good example. That would be one way to think about it. You could actually make an argument in the opposite of that, but yeah, you're generally correct there. You could say the same thing with sleep, actually, right? So yeah, sleep deprivation. You probably want to avoid chronic sleep deprivation, but short acute sleep deprivation may be beneficial. You don't want to be fatigued, but short, massive amounts of fatigue, probably pretty good. You could name any equation here that there's a difference between acute and chronic. And the answer, one of the frank answers is we don't actually know the exact right answer for a chronic in a lot of areas. We still got to work these things out. I mean, we've got this thing where we have to, not to go too off track, but we've got this thing where we got to try to figure out how do we balance getting cancer with immortality, because those things run in opposition. So, optimizing things for longevity, we're not exactly sure how that whole story plays out yet.
Okay. How can you best decide what is best, what to use? I know you have a video on this, very, very well explained, but how can you let us know a little bit of what would it be, the diagram in your head to say, what should I do?
Yeah, the algorithm always runs to me with any of these things, honestly. Supplements is a good example. It depends, and it's always context driven, right? So I always like to ask a series of questions, and that's going to lead us down a trail. And this is what I call the supplement decision making tree that I think you're referring to, right? Mm-hmm. We want to ask questions like, can I fix this with lifestyle first? Can I fix this with food first? If so, I'm almost always going to turn to those things. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule. Like right now, we're getting close to the playoffs in baseball, so I don't necessarily have the time to try to fix lifestyle stuff. I may go straight to a supplement. I may go straight to an IV supplement at a high dose because we got to fix performance in like a few days, and we got a $40 million contract on the line. So I'm not going to dick around with carrots. Like I'm going straight to a vitamin C IV. Here we go. But in general, almost always I'm going food and lifestyle changes first, right? And then you want to ask questions like, does it work? Well, what does work mean? Like, what outcome are you looking for? What percent would qualify as work? What percent wouldn't qualify as work? Is it safe? Has it been demonstrated at this amount and this dose in this person, in this format? Yes and no. Again, how much of an impact are we making? Is it worth it in terms of the cost, right? You're a $30 million a year baseball player. There's really no limit to what we can spend on supplements. You're making $30,000 a year as an amateur boxer. Well, now there's a big difference in what we consider. What are the stakes? So again, we're competing for Olympic gold medal, or you're trying to compete in your first figure competition at the local county fair. This changes the equation a lot of what we're willing to do supplement-wise. So in general, these things should be used for fine-tuning rather than being the base of your program. But those would all be the questions that I would ask leading into it. In addition to that, I guess I'll finish with saying, do we actually know where you're at physiologically? Have we gotten really extensive recent blood work? Have we gotten stool gut testing if that's needed or whatever? And so I'm really, really hesitant to start recommending especially mineral supplementation until I've had really extensive blood work fairly recently, because that stuff has a pretty big impact pretty quickly. And vitamins, especially the water-soluble ones, you're okay guessing on a lot of times, but I really like to see those numbers before I start giving folks things.
Yes, it makes sense, especially when we think about specific vitamins that actually have a toxic level, like vitamin D. Yep. People think they have to supplement with vitamin D, but you actually might not be deficient in the first place. So by supplementing with vitamin D, you might actually be causing harm rather than improving your health.
Yeah, iron's another classic example of that one. You got to be very careful with iron supplementation. Yeah, there's a lot of them. Vitamin C kind of gets a free pass. It's pretty tough to OD on that, but you can. I mean, there's been some studies that have shown vitamin C blunts hypertrophic response depending on the situation. It's an antioxidant. You block inflammation, you block signal for adaptation, you block muscle growth. So yeah, you want to know what you're doing before you start dosing things out.
That's very true. How do you use your algorithm to identify bullshit? When something is so much things around, especially when we want to learn and get into fitness, there is so much stuff around with gurus and fake news or things that they make you to think they're actually true, but they're not even evidence-based. So what would you do in that case? Yeah,
it's a really long question. It's a great one. It's one I'm really passionate about. I love talking about. So I'll have to give you the short answer. There's a nice long video on this one as well. But first and foremost, I'm not sure I have it correct either. I've certainly been fooled plenty of times. I guarantee you something I think is true right now, give it a few months and years, and I'm going to be like, oh, God, how did I miss that one? I mean, it happens all the time. How the hell did I miss that? So my own system fails me quite consistently. But you want to look at things like, what does evidence-based mean, right? And so in general, the quickest way I could say is, I believe the strength of your convictions should match the strength of the total evidence. So if there is not a lot of evidence, that doesn't mean you shouldn't support something. You just shouldn't be solely tied to it. So don't go and try to convince everyone that this thing is correct if there's just a small amount of evidence. Just say, I'm a totally a believer, but I don't know yet. Really, there's not a lot of evidence, but I really am excited about this one. And I'm totally fine with that. The inverse, something that has a lot of evidence to it, I'm probably not going to waste my time with somebody coming and saying things like, the earth is flat. I'm like, all right, if we look at I guess there's a small sliver of chance, right? There is a really minute amount of chance that that's true. But there's so much evidence on the contrary, I'm not wasting my time with that shit until you really, as the saying would go, extraordinary claim would require extraordinary evidence. Absolutely. If we start to build things there, then when I start moving my position, I'll start paying attention to things more. But in general, things that are extremist, things that are absolutist, things that are always eat this, things that are single explanation. So all of your diet problems, all of your health problems are because of these moldy beans in your coffee, or because insulin, or anytime you have a single explanation for massive problems, I'm almost always going to check out, because that's just never how physiology works. So those are kind of like the quick things I'm looking for. Does somebody have massive personal or financial ties to their belief system? That's another red flag. I mean, there's no guarantee that just because you write a book on vegan diets that you're completely biased. That doesn't mean it's the case, right? Just like it doesn't mean just because you got funding from a protein supplement company that you're biased towards protein supplementation, right? But if your entire business and your company and your social media name are tied to a nutrition identity, it's very, very difficult, in fact, probably impossible for you to leave that, which means you're not really thinking through research, you're not open to new information. You have been completely convinced that something is the way it is. I mean, let's go right back to the name of your social media, right? It's not being tied to a specific outcome. You're not the vegetarian dietitian, you're not the high-fat dietitian, you're not the Mediterranean diet dietitian, right? You're the what is the best system to get me into the right outcome places, right? And so if more information comes on the system being more effective or less effective than I thought, then I'll adjust my confidence in that system. Doesn't mean you don't do it anymore. Again, you just adjust your confidence in it. So some folks have done this well over the years, and you've seen folks that like were really high on keto or paleo, and they were really strong, and it was their livelihood, and they sold books on it. But then information came out, data came out, and they've shifted their position. They backed off. They may say, hey, I still like keto a lot, but it's not the panacea that we once thought it was. And I'm totally fine with those folks, right? Or I'm saying, hey, there's a strength in it here, and there's a weakness of it over there. That's all fine. But those are some of the things that go through my head when I think of identifying bullshit in the field. In general, what I do is I create kind of like a radar plot or a spider plot, and I look at the strength of the evidence in all of the areas. Peer-reviewed research. Anecdotal. Have I tried it before? What did I feel? Have I used it with my athletes? That factors into my evidence base as well. What are other qualified people, other dietitians saying that they see, feel, experience? What are other scientists saying? What are we hearing from other folks on the field? And I factor all that stuff in. And when you have a lot of evidence lining up from a lot of different places, I gain confidence in a place. And the last piece I'll say to this is I also do try to be really weary of false magnifying. So in other words, okay, you post something up on your feed about whatever. Okay, great, some supplement you like, a cherry juice extract. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. And then I look around and everyone else reposts the same thing. Well, that's actually just the same piece of information magnified. It's not actually new information. And so it just happens to be the people I follow on social media are probably the reason I follow them is because we think alike, right? And so you may not actually be seeing the true breadth of what's going on in the field because you're only following, seeing, paying attention to, buying books from people who you already think you like and you already think they think like you. And so you do want to be careful of that. And so I would strongly encourage folks to follow people that are not directly in line with what they think at all times, and try to be objective and try to get a better grip of what's happening in the field, not just the field that you're keeping your eyes on. So I do all those things. So I will read papers from other folks, especially studies, and I'll spend time reading other things that are counter to what I think, and that's been good because, I mean, great example, and I'll finish on this, is, at the beginning of the keto craze, I was completely anti-keto, and everyone that I was involved with, everyone's around was completely anti-keto, thought it was horrible, terrible, terrible, awful. And because I interact with a lot of the folks that were hard in that field, and these are not scientists generally, these are the quacks and gurus and the things that we complain about, well, they actually got a lot right on that. They got a lot wrong, but they got a lot right too. And we on our side of the evidence missed the boat on that one big time too. And so I had to change my position on it, and I did, and I have, and I've changed it a few times throughout the years. But it's really, really important that we don't just dismiss folks just because they are not RDs or they're not PhDs. Because the fact of the matter is, with nutrition science, we've dropped the fucking ball several times. Really big. So don't just pay attention to your own circle there. Make sure you're listening to the other folks as well. So that's a bunch of the stuff that goes into my BS detection.
Absolutely. And I absolutely recommend that everyone goes to see the full video that actually goes into in depth of every single thing you want to pay attention to. I am so appreciated that you came into this live, have shared all this knowledge and your time with us. Okay. But I'm really grateful you came here.
Likewise, fun chatting with you.
All right. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay. Peace out.